Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for waiting. My name is Nina Khrushcheva. I teach here at the International Affairs Program and one of the organizers of this event, Media in the Age of Barack Obama. I had a perfectly written introduction with the appropriate bios of both speakers, and somehow I forgot it in my office, and I really apologize. So let me just say a few words, the ones that I remember from those very distinguished and long pieces of bio that was delivered to me before. We have two speakers today. One is Gary Younge, and he's a Guardian columnist and feature writer who is now based in New York. He's also formerly the Guardian correspondent, was New York correspondent. He's teaching at Brooklyn. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't have it on this piece of paper. Brooklyn College. He's a visiting professor at Brooklyn College. And the author of 3 books. One, the most recent one, is Strange in a Strange Land, Encounters as the Disunited in the Disunited States. And also the author of No Place Like Home. Last year, or 2008, I think, Gary Younge won the prestigious James Cameron Prize for his reporting on the campaign of Barack Obama 2008 and the presidential elections. Another speaker is Ian Buruma, who is currently a professor at Bard College, and there he teaches courses on human rights and journalism. He, as you may know, has contributed to very many very prestigious European and also United States publications. He's a contributor to the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and the New York Times, among many other publications. Author of numerous books, and each and every one of them won awards. He was one of the 100. He was picked as one of the 100 intellectuals done in 2008 by Foreign Policy magazine. His latest book is The China Lover. It's a novel, and he has a book coming out next month, published by Princeton University Press. And please remind me the title of it. I forgot, Ian. You can't remember. Okay, here you go. So we both don't remember. But his other books, which you may have read, the recent books, The Murder in Amsterdam, The Death of Theo van Gogh, and Limits of Tolerance, and Occidentalism, The West in the Eyes of Its Enemies. Ian Buruma wrote a really interesting column, I remember a year ago, talking about the perception of Barack Obama in Europe. And I think with this question, I actually would like to start this meeting. Indeed, the perception of Barack Obama in the United States and Europe, they weren't entirely different, or weren't different at all, I guess, in 2008. But a year later, into Barack Obama's presidency, I would assume that probably perceptions are somewhat different. And I would like to actually ask the speakers if they could elaborate on that, because in the United States, the excitement is all by over. And it would be really interesting to know what's happening in this regard in Europe. We'll have a conversation for about, they will have a conversation for, I don't know, 40 minutes, maybe a little longer. And then Sean Jacobs, who in fact was the organizer of this event with the media concentration of the International Affairs Program, will take over and moderate question and answers, and we'll try to finish about 7:30. Thank you.
The question is, what has changed in 1 year? Well, I'll say something about Europe, I think, and then maybe Gary can talk about the US. A disclaimer first. I have no special knowledge to impart. You know just as much about this subject as I do. So I feel a little bit of a fraud, but I'll do my best. I think there were at least three reasons why he was enormously popular in Europe a year ago when he was running his campaign. One is universal, which is that he is simply an extremely attractive candidate. He's handsome, he's extremely articulate, he's extremely bright, and so on and so forth. The second reason is that he wasn't George Bush, which was a big plus. And the third, I think perhaps the most interesting reason, is that at a time that the press in general were writing off the importance of the United States, especially in Europe, where the received opinion in sort of amongst the European chattering class in the press was that American power was in deep decline. It didn't really matter anymore what America said or did. China, India mattered now. There were books coming out about the 21st century, the European century, and so on and so forth. America just didn't matter. And I think the adulation of Obama in Berlin and other parts of Europe showed how much most Europeans still wanted America to matter. And they were so delighted that here was somebody that could sort of be as enthusiastic about as they used to be in the JFK days. And there is something slightly childish, if you like, about the relationship between Europe and the United States, I think, in that since World War II, the enormous dependence of Europe, first economically and still in terms of security, on the United States has in some ways infantilized Europeans, in that they love, like an adolescent, to kick their father's shins whenever they have a chance, but they still depend enormously on the US as the country that'll sort of do the hard lifting while the Europeans can feel culturally superior and enjoy their new prosperity. So it makes people very anxious, even though they don't always admit it, when America decline, when the influence of America is seen to decline, when America looks less powerful than it was before, which may or may not be true. I mean, to some extent, of course, it is true. So I think Obama, in a way, represented a JFK Mark II to people. And that meant that the expectations were way too high. I mean, people really thought because he wasn't George Bush, because he was so charismatic, and because he promised to make America important again and change the world and do all the things that George Bush hadn't, people expected miracles. And of course, miracles don't happen, especially not to a president of the United States who's hemmed in on all sides, and any change that he can make, I think, will be necessarily incremental. So to the extent that there is disappointment, it's because he couldn't deliver on something that was undeliverable. I would argue the same is probably true in the United States itself, but I think his popularity is still pretty high, but he's no longer the Messiah. And maybe that's all to the good, because we don't really want messiahs in our politics. We want to be more realistic, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I would go a bit further than Ian in saying that it wasn't just that he wasn't George Bush. In many ways, he was the anti-Bush. He was the antithesis. He was eloquent where Bush was monosyllabic, and he was prepared to be engaged, whereas where Bush was isolationist. And that actually, in a way, the possibility of his election suggested the possible halt of the American decline, because the way that the Bush administration was going was actually accelerating its relative decline to other countries. Bush had pushed militarily and economically, had pushed this country to its limits and really had shown its hand. So in the quagmire of Iraq and in what was afterwards understood in Afghanistan to be a quagmire, Bush had actually illustrated the limits of American military power. And then Obama really suggested, through the possibility of diplomacy and engagement, the possibility of reasserting some kind of more realistic kind of engagement in world affairs. I think another thing about Europe is that he stood in stark contrast to the absolutely pathetic standard of leadership for the most part throughout Europe, that Europe is in a terrible place. Berlusconi, Blair and then Brown, you can pretty much look, with the exception of Angela Merkel, who's still very popular, it's very difficult to find a European leader who wasn't below 50 in approval ratings. And some of them, Berlusconi being a good example, being either a clown or with Brown and Blair really having lost much in the way of credibility. And similarly, most of the kind of heat had gone out of Sarkozy's leadership. And so there was the notion that there could be political leadership that you could believe in, that you could get excited about. And even with Angela Merkel, I wouldn't say Germans are excited about her. They're happy with her, but they're not excited about her. So he suggested the possibility of electrifying leadership at a time when it didn't exist. And finally, I would kind of agree with Ian that I think I described it at one stage as being like methadone, Obama, is that Europe was frustrated with America, but it had not found a way to stop it. So all it could do was whinge and whine from the sidelines. It could remove any diplomatic credibility, which is what the French did at the UN, but it couldn't actually stop America doing what it wanted to do. So there was a sense in Europe, the Europeans wanted a vote, and they couldn't have one, but what they could do was get excited. And I think the other thing that spanned the globe really was this notion of this black guy, that this was possible in America. And when I go back to Britain, what I sense is a kind of delayed response to what's going on here. I mean, mostly I think this is true of the rest of Europe, but I'll just speak about Britain, which I know well, is that we get so much of America through books and TV and music and so on that we think we know it, and we really don't. And there are things, big things, and not just these, but they're a good example: religion, guns, the social conservatism, the actual structures of government in terms of what the president can and can't do, that Europeans don't really understand. And so there's this sense of things being possible when they're kind of when they're not. It's like, well, he's elected now, so of course he's going to do what he said he was going to do. But it's not a parliamentary system in a way that most of Europe understands. But the Guardian took around this life-size effigy of Obama around London and got people to respond to it. And it was really kind of funny. People were running up and hugging it and kissing it, and and there was, after the previous 8 years, this sense of kind of deliverance, which is as much to do with what had gone before as what had gone after. And I think to kind of end where a place where Ian might take it up is that I do think both here and in Europe there is a kind of discursive problem about Obama, which is that people haven't found a way in the popular conversation. There doesn't seem to be a way in which people have found to kind of talk about him sensibly and cogently as a politician. So he's either in heaven or in hell, but he's very rarely here on earth. And that can make things very, very difficult. It can make things very difficult to kind of, if there's a discursive problem, then all discussion is tough. I just did a 2-part radio documentary for the World Service called Opposing Obama. And it was about, I went to Kentucky and Arkansas, to counties that hadn't voted Republican since the Reconstruction, or at least since Eisenhower, some of them, that had voted against Obama in 2004 and in 2008. And the idea was to find out what that was about. And the documentary turned into a thing about the Tea Party movement and this kind of base of white working class and self-employed kind of resistance to government spending. Some of it was racism, whatever. But what was most intriguing were the responses to this documentary, much more intriguing than the documentary itself. It got it was the most commented on documentary for the last 6 months. And many people were opposed to the very idea that the BBC should be doing this at all. How dare you discuss his opponents? You know, they'd say, you know, would you have done a thing called bashing Bush? Which I said, well, if it was called beating around the bush and it was in 2006 and we were talking about why people would have opposed Bush, absolutely it would have been completely irresponsible not to. But this rage of, for some people, of even talking about him in a certain way, and that you get from the right as well, that unless you're prepared to say, to start the conversation by saying, obviously we're talking about the devil here, and then go on to talk about Obama, then people can't engage, which I think is actually a reflection of a deeper problem in American political discourse at the moment.
Yeah, I don't know if I entirely share that take. I mean, I don't know. But was the reaction to the BBC documentary because it was critical of Obama, or was it because people felt that too much attention was being paid to views that they found reprehensible? In other words, a little bit like the protests against having the leader of the British National Party, the sort of neo-Nazi party in Britain, take part in a respectable talk show on the BBC, in which they felt was giving him too much credibility and respectability, whereas many people felt such a person shouldn't have been on the BBC at all.
I mean, actually, the complaints came in with the trailers, even before the documentary had started. And no, some people claim that, and I think that's a really difficult argument to make when, at the moment, the Tea Party is movement is actually the most dynamic force there is in American politics right now. It doesn't mean it's good, but it's dynamic, it's happening. And the idea that one wouldn't examine that and one wouldn't look at why people are opposing Obama, I think is deeply flawed. And that I don't know that there's been a moment in American politics, for example, where race hasn't been an issue. I don't think there has. And so the degree to which some of the people that we spoke to expressed racist views, that's part of American politics. And so not to cover these people who had genuine, real beefs. You know, one woman who was at a food bank said, it's given a lot of money to the banks, given a lot of money to the car industry. I'm coming here for food. I mean, these are things that need to be covered, but that there was a group of people that didn't want to hear any of them. I don't think it would have mattered. I think it would have been very similar. I remember speaking to an evangelical family in Pennsylvania in 2004 who'd lost a son in the war. I asked them why they thought support for the war was fading, and they said, the media. So it's a kind of very convenient way of just not engaging with things you don't want to know. Well,
maybe I'm sure racism is part of it, but it'd be interesting to look at the populist reactions to Roosevelt's New Deal and to Jimmy Carter and to Clinton, which was often no less vicious, although it wasn't perhaps quite so organized yet. But I think it's been part of American politics for a very long time that when a liberal president, especially a liberal president with ambitious plans, came to power, there is a much longer history of populist reaction to that, saying this socialist is taking the country away from us, we have to stand up for our freedom, and so on and so forth. I mean, very similar arguments were made against the New Deal, I believe. So it may not be entirely unique to Obama. I think there are, and I'm not sure in Europe at least you can say that he's in hell with anybody. I mean, people may be critical.
No, that's more in the States.
And the other thing I think the reason why people find it hard to engage with it is precisely what, because of something you said earlier, which is that because foreigners, and not just Europeans, non-Americans outside America, see so many American TV shows, Hollywood movies, and all that, I agree with you, they think they know this country much better than they do. In fact, they don't. And if you don't know how Congress works, if you don't know how the lobby industry in Washington works, if you don't know all the if you don't know exactly the position of the Supreme Court here and so on, it's very difficult to actually engage, because you don't really understand what's hampering Obama, what's the obstacles he faces, and all that. And I think that's one of the reasons why there isn't that much sensible commentary on American politics, and including Obama, because partly it's out of ignorance. Now, something else has happened in America itself. I mean, it's part of a worldwide phenomenon, but which is very odd in a way, which is that there's a worldwide, at least in democracies, because of the globalization, because of the economic crisis, for all kinds of reasons, but there is a strong populist wave sweeping the Western world at the moment, meaning a deep resentment against the political elites. And again, this is not a new phenomenon. It's happened before in history, rarely with very agreeable results. And in America, in Europe, you see it. You saw it partly with the election of Sarkozy, but you see it with quite nasty anti-immigration, right-wing populists in Austria, in Holland, in Belgium, and so on, who are doing much better than they ever did before in modern history, apart from the 30s, of course. And in America, I think something similar is going on. You have a large number of people who are very anxious because of their economic situation. They're anxious about the position of the US in the world. They're anxious that jobs are going to China and so on. So there's a very strong anti-elitist mood. Now, the odd thing is that if there was ever an elitist, it was George W. Bush, or a member of the elite. He was born with the most silver of silver spoons. And yet he somehow got away with posing as the good old boy from Texas, who was sort of one of them, as it were. Whereas here's a president who came from a far humbler background, who pulled himself up by his bootstraps, who's, of course, associated much more with the elite. He talks like a Harvard man. He is a Harvard man. He's eloquent and so on. And so in a mood like that, being eloquent, being articulate as he is, writing, being a graceful writer, which is a highly unusual phenomenon in politics, is already, to the populists, is already a strike against you. So the fact that Sarah Palin is inarticulate is, for her image, is good. I mean, she talks just like us, is the reception, whereas Obama talks like a toff. And I think this is not just something that's going on in America. It's a worldwide thing, as I said, but each country has its own form of populism. And it's because of historical differences, it's playing out in a different way in Germany or in Britain or in Holland or in the United States, but it's part of the same thing.
Yeah, I think one of the big differences here is that because of money in politics, because of the nature of the political culture, all of these forces are absorbed into the main party, whereas in most of Europe, either there's proportional representation or there's enough electoral space for them to form their own, and so to have a distinction. You know, in most of Europe, there'll be a centre-right or right-wing party that would have been kind of northeastern Republicans, and maybe some in the West, and then there is a much more hardline, usually xenophobic, usually racist party, which would have absorbed a lot of the American South. But because of the broad coalitions that are Democrats and that are Republicans, those are all absorbed into these two groups, and therefore a group like the Tea Party movement, for example, can leverage its activism and its support for into the corridors of power. So you do get maybe only, I think it was 17 Republican congressmen tabling a birther motion, you know, that these things can actually find themselves kind of, they course through the veins of the American electoral politics, I think, much, or can much quicker. But there was something else that you said about populist movements rising against liberal presidents, which I think in a way is the point I'm trying to make, which is that there is a reluctance in the media to discuss Obama like any other president. And that he didn't invent many of these things. America was massively polarized before he came in, and in a way, he is, some of these responses are a reflection of that polarization. There was populism, you know, there was a kind of populism before, and in fact, in many ways, I think Sarah Palin represents actually what George Bush was performing. That Sarah Palin didn't grow up with huge advantages. She did grow up on the kind of, you know, periphery of America, and she didn't find religion late, as Bush did in the bottom of a whiskey bottle. She didn't have massive benefits from her parents or anybody else. And unlike Bush, who did go to Yale, where he did incredibly badly, but he did go. Not
incredibly badly. He did about as well as Gore.
He got, well, then that's two of them did incredibly badly. He got a C, I think. She is genuinely ignorant of world affairs and proud of it. And in a way, hers is a kind of downward aspiration that people have, that, you know, yeah, finally there's someone who doesn't know what I don't know, and that makes some people feel very comfortable. But I do think there is this reluctance, actually on the left and the right, to discuss Obama as another president, and to look at what he does within that.
Maybe that was partly because again, it'd be interesting to look at how Kennedy was described. I think the press was pretty indulgent to him too while he was still alive, and certainly after he was after he died. But I'm not so sure this is right. I think if you look at the sort of mainstream press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, and so on, I'm not sure it's quite true that people haven't written about him as they do about presidents in their first year of office. I'm not sure that the change is that marked. I think what is new, and again, it's not just in America, is to, and we don't know the outcome yet, but is to see the influence of populist movements on the mainstream parties and on the press. Now, those are not quite the same things, but they're linked. As you say, in Europe, this sort of the right-wing populism is usually isolated in small parties that get between 10 and 15% of the vote at good times for them, and now they're getting, in some countries, getting more, which is worrying. But it's the influence on the mainstream parties, because even in those systems of proportional representation, they're driving the popularity of the populists, are driving the traditional conservative parties further to the right as well. In Britain and America, as you say, the Republicans and the Tories would often soak up this kind of sentiment, because having a splinter party like the BNP never gets you anywhere near government. And so if you have any ambition at all, and you're seriously right-wing, you'd still try and work through the Tories. Now, traditionally, both the Tories and the Republicans would pay lip service to these people and their sentiments. And once they were in power, it was sort of business as usual, meaning business primarily. And this was true of Ronald Reagan. It was true of every Republican president, certainly true of Nixon. I mean, to some extent, they had an influence, but they didn't dominate the party in the way that they would now like to do so. Now, it remains to be seen whether they can really do this beyond state level. It also, and then the big question is, will it destroy the Republican Party for a long time? Or will it somehow, will they manage to get one of their candidates in at a national level? And all that we don't know. I mean, we'll see. But I think, talking about the press, technology has changed the game somewhat, which is that until not so long ago, public opinion in terms of the press was largely shaped by more or less respectable network companies on television and sort of fairly mainstream newspapers who had more or less responsible editors. I mean, there was a yellow press, but public opinion was still very much influenced by what appeared in the serious newspapers. And then the ranters and ravers did not really have a big influence. And I think now in the world of talk radio, of blogs, and the diminishing influence of the sort of traditional filters of the mainstream press, the importance of the ranters and ravers has grown exponentially. I don't think, I mean, again, people in the audience probably have more knowledge about this than I do. In the days of what was his name? Father Coughlin. I mean, the ranters and ravers have always been around, and they obviously their influence was never negligible. But I doubt if Father Coughlin ever had the clout that somebody like Glenn Beck now seems to be having. Now, whether that will translate into national political success is the big question. I don't know. I mean, maybe in the question and answer session we can be enlightened by you, but I don't know.
But that very point really is the kind of fragmentation of the media and the bespoke kind of news that people can get is in a way my point. That you quote the New York Times and the Washington Post as being like, well, you don't know that they haven't treated him as they would any other president. I'm going to go on to mention a few ways in which they haven't and couldn't. But then they don't matter as much as they did anyway. And actually, they're not driving an awful lot of the conversation, because the conversation, actually half the time, they're following the conversation. You'll read something in the New York Times, and what they'll say is, hey, did you see what was on these blogs? You know, that I don't think they're running the show in the way that they did, but there are a few ways in which I think Obama, his rise was particular, that in a way made it almost impossible to talk about him like any other president. The first and the most obvious one is race. That God knows how many times this man's picture was on the front page of Time and Newsweek at the beginning. They just couldn't get enough of it. And it was partly because he was, you know, he was handsome and he was new, and that's another aspect, is his meteoric rise. But that the press and actually a large section of the political class didn't actually know how to talk intelligently about a serious, viable black candidate for the presidency. And so, on the one hand, you had the fairly crude racism of Fox and Michelle Obama's a baby mama and the terrorist jab that was the fist bump and all the rest of it. And on the other hand, you had what I kind of call the super Negro effect, that kind of, here he comes to save the day, you know, and there's only one kind of political figure that you can have that's viable and black, and it was the last good one, quote unquote, would have been Martin Luther King. And that's how far you have to go back and how good you have to be, and in a way how dead you have to be, because if Martin Luther King was still alive, he would, I dare say, be pilloried. He was actually being pilloried during the period when he was killed. And so there was, first of all, that problem, which I saw with my own eyes, the press engaged in a kind of incredibly strange, somewhat at times fawning, at other times kind of intrigued. It was like teenagers who'd discovered sex, that they had discovered this possibility of a black president, and they really kind of didn't know how to handle it. And it would follow from that as soon as the election is then over, that there's going to be a somewhat precipitous fall into reality. So they had to deal with their excitement by talking about their disappointment. But the other thing is the kind of quite extraordinary and dire circumstances in which during which he came to power. That kind of capitalism in America was imploding, and that gave an urgency to anything that he did, because people would say, "Where's my change? It's been 100 days already. Where's my job? Where's my stimulus?" I have a friend who works at Oakland Library who had someone come in and said, "I'm here for the stimulus money." And that change for a large number of people became not just a slogan, but a very urgent need. And that's what you see kind of playing out in lots of different ways with the Tea Party people, but with various others. And that also created demands of this particular president and presidency, which wouldn't have been, it's difficult to think of the last time, 2 wars and a massive economic crisis, that someone's been elected in those circumstances. And if you align the drastic nature of the circumstances with the notion of the super Negro, that here is this man who's come to resolve these kind of tensions and these problems, and who keeps saying, I can't do it on my own, I won't do it overnight, and so on, but people still respond to that by saying, well, I need it now, using hope as though it were an insult. In her speech to the Tea Party movement, Sarah Palin said, how's that hopey changey thing working out? And it was a ridiculing of the notion that there would be hope. It's like, you idiots, what are you doing? What are you doing hoping for stuff? That if you ally those two things, it's unlikely that covering him as any other president was even possible, actually.
But I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure race is always there in the background, but I'm not sure whether you're not overstating the significance of the colour of his skin. Because first of all, the adulation was just as strong in Camelot and the young JFK and his beautiful wife, and I mean that was almost as messianic. And I'm also not sure it's true that the mainstream press is particularly negative about him now. I don't think there is this sense, if you read the mainstream papers, that there were these fantastic expectations and he's done terribly in the manner of his work. I mean, the attacks aren't particularly vicious. Now, the people who are viciously attacking him never had any hope in the first place. They never liked the guy. The kind of people that Sarah Palin is appealing to never had any great expectations of Obama because they were never among his fans. And so the people who thought that he was going to solve everything, who may now be disappointed, yes, there is that disappointment for all the reasons you say, but I don't think that that's reflected particularly in the way he's treated in the press. I don't think he's being, there are unfair or negative attacks in the liberal press that had perhaps the highest expectations. The idea that, I mean, it's not the people who thought he was heaven are not the same people who now think he's hell. The people who now think he's hell always thought he was hell.
No, but I didn't say that the press were necessarily being unfair. I said that there'd been a precipitous decline. That actually, if you start up here, then coming down to the place where he's going to be is going to be precipitous. But also, it's very difficult to actually. I'm not overestimating the role of race in this. I think, if anything, you're underestimating it. I don't know about JFK because because I wasn't there. But for this, were people dancing literally dancing in the street in Harlem and Detroit and Brooklyn? I actually, while the election of a young, good-looking Catholic was a very big deal for America in 1960, I don't think it had the same kind of totemic resonance that the election of a black man had in 2008,
sure
specifically coming after Bush.
I'm not sure you're right. I think if you, there's a very interesting book by photographs by Bruce Davidson, made in the, I think, around about 1970, called East 100th Street, in which he took photographs of people living in one street in Harlem. And on the walls of these really poor, mostly black tenement apartments, there is very often a picture of Jesus, and there's a picture of JFK.
Usually Jesus, JFK, and MLK, usually.
Yes. So I think he did have a huge impact also, and so did Clinton. Clinton was hugely popular amongst the black population.
I mean, my point isn't whether it was huge or not, it's whether it was as huge. Now, I know because I was here for Clinton. Well, I mean, it's partly our role as commentators to kind of gauge these things in terms of public mood, but I know for Clinton that the election of Clinton in '92 was nothing like the election of Obama in 2008 in terms of the kind of the sense that you have of the feel in the country, and that's partly what Clinton followed, which was Bush's dad, and it's partly, you know, who Clinton was. And it's not that there wasn't excitement, but it's of a different order, and to kind of to downplay, I think, of course race can always be over-exaggerated, but to downplay the role of race in that, 100% of black people 100% of black men in New York State voted for Obama.
There I would agree with you entirely. I think from the point of view, that is different from former presidents in the sense that, like you probably, I was in Harlem on the night of the election. There was enormous sense of pride, which would have been of a slightly different order than if it had been a white president, because there was the sense, and I remember this very well, on election night, there was a man, a youngish man in his 30s, black man, who was screaming at the top of his voice, "My son can be the president of the United States now." And that kind of pride is new. That had never happened before. But again, I think he's still very popular in Harlem, and I don't think that pride, particular source of pride, has gone away. As far as the white population is concerned, I think it is possible to. I would agree that you can't say race plays no part. Certainly, it plays a big part in the populist agitation against him. But I think one should be slightly careful with that. I don't think that the criticism that you now read on his handling of the health bill or the war in Afghanistan or anything like that is really all that linked to the color of his skin.
Well, then you're misunderstanding me. I'm talking about. I'm not saying that I don't think that the opposition to him is driven by race. I think it's informed by race, and I think its intensity is underpinned by race. But if he's half as liberal as his supporters think he is, then it would stand to reason that there would be a reaction against that. My point is that in his election, the fact of his race was a major factor in the raising of hopes and in the way that the media actually reported him and actually understood him, that there was an inevitable precipitous decline in how they would understand what he would actually do.
I would agree with you to the extent that certainly during the campaign it did play a large part. It made white people feel nice and warm and liberal because look what a great country we are. We can elect a black. That certainly was a factor. He was, apart from the fact that he was also a very good-looking black, and as I said earlier, amongst sort of black Americans, there was an enormous sense of pride. Whether that fits your description of people's expectation of the super Negro who's going to sort of solve all our problems, that I'm not so sure about. I think that the pride in electing a black man was certainly there. I think it added to his glamour and his appeal. But the idea that he would be, because he was black, somehow better placed to solve all the problems of people's lives, that I'm not so sure.
I mean, my point was about the press characterization of him, not the... and the press, just like Bush as the good old boy, or Kennedy, the windsurfing flip-flopper, or whoever it is, the press works through a series of frames and caricatures, and that it was the press. It's otherwise, I mean, and it makes sense. It's kind of new. It's exciting. If you're a journalist, on one level, you're always hoping for a change of government because that's going to be kind of more interesting and different. And he was different. And one of the key ways, when he would stand up, he stood up in Iowa after he'd won there, and he says, "They said this day will never come." And nobody thinks he's talking about, people were talking about the day when Barack Obama would win Iowa. It's like a black guy's won Iowa. So race was always, it was central to his meaning, even when it was absent from his message. And the press loved that. I know that, the British press loved it. But I think also, if we're talking about the mainstream press here, Time, Newsweek, you would have to find some other explanation for, he's not that good looking. I mean, he's fine, but I mean, if it's good looking you want, Brad Pitt would do better than Obama. Why would he adorn so many covers so often? And the reason is that, there was something about that. And of course, there is a hint of jest in the notion of the super Negro. But what I'm trying to say is that black politicians, in the characterization of the media, being an average politician who's black is not really going to cut it. That Obama couldn't just be Kerry or just be, in order to get where he was going to go, he had to be completely impeccable in every single way. And, so George Bush's wife, Laura, actually killed someone in a car in Midland, Texas. Kind of never really came up. Michelle Obama wrote a thesis in Princeton that about the black experience in Princeton. It came up quite a lot. So there would be kind of two ways in which Obama, Sarah Palin's daughter can be unwed and pregnant. If Obama's daughters were older, that was not going to happen. You have the kind of quotes from Harry Reid and Joe Biden. He was he didn't speak too black. He was light-skinned. He was clean. And all of these things which were said by the political class were also kind of importance and intrigue and interest to the media class. And they went with it. There was some excitement about the possibility that this could happen, not least because it came from nowhere, or apparently from nowhere.
Yeah.
Mine, I'll just pull it closer. How about that?
Yes, but I take your point. But in many ways, what was written about him was also true. I mean, Michelle Obama did not kill anybody. She is very brainy. She did go to Princeton. He is very articulate. One of the problems for caricaturists is that he was very difficult to caricature.
But my point is, he had to be those things.
Yeah, you may be right. Perhaps we should hear you now.
I didn't really want to stop this. I was really enjoying this. But I think what we can do is, shall we do like 3 questions?
Sure.
And then there's a mic over there if you want. By the way, my name's Sean Jacobs. So there's a mic over there if you want to get up and ask a question. No speeches. And if you can make a comment if you want. But try not to make another if you want like a speech. So do we have any questions?
You have to play your part now.
I think oh, in the. If you want to ask a question, maybe if you want to go around and stand in line, if you want.
Isn't there a mic to pass around?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no mic
just a
to pass
very
around.
brief comment. I was in Brazil when the election took place, and I can tell you that the people of Brazil really wanted Obama to win. They just felt that he was going to bring a new energy, a new hope to the world for all people. My question is, in light of what you said about the workings of Congress, you have to really know about the workings of Congress before you can engage in what Obama has been able to do. Can you tell us what you had hoped Obama could do, knowing your knowledge of the workings of Congress?
Well, I mean, I don't have anything very original to say about that. Like probably most of us, I would have hoped that he would have got the health bill through, that he would have got a little further on the climate bill. But I can't say that I'm deeply disappointed by him so far. He's only had 1 year. And I think change inevitably is going to be incremental. And I think one should still give him the benefit of the doubt that he's playing the long game. And so I can't say that I am deeply disappointed. I think he could have perhaps done better on those bills, possibly. I'm a bit disappointed on Guantanamo Bay. What else? I don't know. Larry Summers and co. Was that a big mistake? I don't know. I could see why he did it. I think, unlike a lot of people on Iran and China, although engagement, which seemed such an attractive quality after George W. Bush, sort of diplomatic engagement instead of huffing and puffing and using military force, was a very welcome change, but engagement so far hasn't really got him very far in terms of Iran, China, Pakistan, and other North Korea. But I think he's actually, by playing it cool in Iran, not coming out with great statements in support of the demonstrations and so on, I think was the right thing to do. Because I think it would have been very easy for him to grandstand and be much more forceful in his language than he was, but that would have, I think, undermined the credibility of the opposition in Iran by making it much easier for the government to say, look, these people are all being manipulated by the United States and so on. So I think he got the tone of that right. I think he was also right to try and engage China and not antagonize them with rhetoric, bellicose or hostile rhetoric to begin with. And I think, again, because it didn't pay off, he's now getting tougher. And I think he's also was right to meet the Dalai Lama and to sell arms to Taiwan. And I don't think it's going to cause a huge split with China because there are many other things at stake. So in terms of diplomacy, I don't think he's made any huge breakthroughs, but I think he's got it more or less right.
Yeah, I kind of think that I wish he'd used the performance that a president can use during the summer. He was absent during the summer when I think he could have been much more present in terms of the healthcare bill, and I think that to a large extent the momentum of the healthcare bill was lost during the summer when during those town hall meetings which were disrupted, and that they lost the whole framing of the thing, and suddenly they had to deny, crazy propositions about death panels and stuff like that when they could have been much more forceful. I mean, mostly, and there are things that he promised to do which I wish he didn't. Like I wish he wasn't escalating the war in Afghanistan. I think that's a mistake. he's always played, I mean, his whole MO has been the long game. So during the election campaign, there was this moment shortly after Palin was nominated, which kind of we forget now, but that she provided this huge amount of ballast to the Republican ticket. And there was about a week, 10 days, when it looked like it might work. And there was a lot of panic, particularly from his investors. And somebody did this mock-up of it was a picture of him standing like that, and underneath it said, "Chill the fuck out, I've got this." And that when he saw that, Valerie Jarrett, who's now one of his main advisors, showed him that. And when he saw that, he actually said, "Exactly, this is not, you know, a big deal for me." And where the media is concerned, he has quite a lot of contempt for the 24-hour news cycle and so on. And there was that moment quite early on in the presidency where Ed Henry from CNN asked him why he didn't comment on something. I can't remember what it was, but why he hadn't commented on something. And he said, "Because I like to know what I'm talking about before I speak." The suggestion was that the pressure just to speak was overwhelming. But I must say the thing that I've been most disappointed about is actually not been him, because I didn't actually invest huge amounts of hope in him, but his supporters. That his supporters went home. That after having been mobilized for this campaign and claiming that they were a movement, by and large, and obviously there are exceptions, but most of those exceptions were there to start with, they kind of demobilized. And actually, in order for it to be possible, unless you believe in the kind of great man theory of history, Obama, when he's going into these meetings with pharmaceutical companies, with Republicans or whatever, he needs to have his own Tea Party movement. He has to have his own group of very cussed, determined people who want him to fulfill his agenda, because without him, he's, you know, he's a guy with a plan in a room with other people who may have more money, more support, more leverage. And so, and there are pockets. I went down to Raleigh, Durham, where they were still organizing, and where, when the Obama campaign left in November 2008, the local organizers demanded that they left the lists of people. They said, you know, we collected them. We're going to be here after you've left, and we want to carry on organizing. And they really have done kind of great work down there in North Carolina, I think. But that in general, I think the fact that this large numbers of people who were entered politics for the first time and were incredibly excited, but who are now watching it on TV and wondering what went wrong, and what went wrong is that they're watching it on TV, I think.
Well, people are sort of waiting, and there's a question there. Okay.
Clearly, the power of Obama's candidacy and the current state in which you reside can serve to underscore the power of the military and financial institutions. And it used to be, at about a year of a new president, the political capital had been expended. So a lot of what got done in the first year, or what you could hope to get done before. Almost talking about what can be done in the second term. But what do you think going forward? We talked a bit about the past. Can or should or will the media do? What can be the influence of the media in the modern state? And do you think this whole conceit of a year is kind of bunk at this point? And we talked about the past. What do you kind of portend going forward?
I do think it's bunk. I do think that people like round numbers. So 100 days, 6 months, a year. The idea that any administration could really resolve what was inherited within a year, I think is kind of is crazy. It feels to me like, and this isn't just about Obama. This is another way in which he's like everybody else. I've been here since December 2002 in the States. When I arrived, the Democrats were dead, and they were maybe never coming back. And, you know, the Republicans had just, in the media framing, the Republicans had just won the midterms, and, you know, Democrats were hopeless and, you know, terrible. And then 2004, what was actually a narrow victory for Bush, you know, really just, you know, more nails in that coffin. And then 2006, the Republicans were dead. And then in 2008, they were being buried. And there seems to be a drama, or a desire for drama, in the kind of electoral rhythms that really isn't in keeping with kind of, you know, where the country's at necessarily, that large numbers of people switch their votes, and that kind of, you know, the country's a lot more purple than it is red or blue. It's always seemed to me. And that if you look at, you know, the way that, for example, the distinctions with the electoral map, which is really deceiving, because it's mostly any city with 500,000 people or more is Democrat. In 2004, when Bush won and everybody was talking about conservative revival for another generation, Dallas elected a lesbian Latina sheriff. You know, the mayor of Utah was way more left-wing than the mayor of New York. The mayor of Salt Lake City, rather, was way more left-wing than the mayor of New York. Rocky Anderson, who was pro-gay marriage, anti-war, was really doing a lot of stuff on climate change. And so my guess is that what will happen will be, we're already in the long run up to 2010. So that's what the media will talk about, the kind of, it's already shifted from Republicans picking up gains to Republicans could get the House. So that kind of horse race has already started. And then after that will be the election and who's going to be his challenger and all of that. I don't see much difference in much of that. The only thing that I think could be a wild card, a couple of wild cards. One is the economy. If the economy picks up, it just changes the nature of the conversation. You know, at the moment he's still struggling, and because of the amnesic quality of kind of political conversation in many places, not just in America, already the notion that, well, look, this is the thing that I inherited has become kind of, already seems like among many people to be a tired excuse, many people that he actually really does need to care about, not just the kind of people who didn't like him anyway. But I think if the economy picks up in meaningful ways, I think you're right. And if if you start seeing troops coming back from Iraq, and there's a notion that in some way that has been resolved, that I think that just changes the conversation, which is, at the moment, when I go out reporting, not from the people who always hated him, but from people who were either on the fence, maybe they voted Republican but they didn't hate him, or maybe they were independent and they did vote for him, is what's happened, what's he done? Can't see it. You know, it's a problem of delivery. And that the sooner people feel some tangible effect, some substantial effect to this great symbolic moment, I think the quicker the media framing and also the political discussion changes.
So one of the things that we heard, one of the frames around Obama during the campaign and after was that he was, probably for good reason, was that he was a great campaigner and that he really understood the internet. And that seemed to me, and this is, I'm wondering if you share this perception, to have disappeared as soon as he came into power. That is, that he wasn't able to translate that into a media strategy that really took advantage of the possibilities of this decentralized, fragmenting media. And I'm wondering if you share that opinion and what that, if that is indeed something that presidents can even do anymore.
I think he has been campaigning because he goes out on the road a lot, you know, to places. Was he in Vegas today or tomorrow? I mean, he goes to. in a way, I feel like he kind of didn't really stop campaigning, but that people don't necessarily want a campaigner right now. They want someone who's delivering things. Do you know what I mean? That the kind of, in a way, the kind of promise of what he might do is becoming, as time goes on, inevitably, is less alluring than what he actually does. And but I think that's, it hasn't had the effect that it used to, that it did when he was on the campaign trail, which was to kind of gee up large numbers of people to actually go do things. They're really kind of more televisual media events that don't then necessarily translate into any action. And that it was stunning to go to any Obama rally, and I went to loads, way too many really, and to see them work the crowd, be like, hold up your mobile phone, I want you to call the Obama administration, I want you to call the campaign, and then they would have all these phone numbers, and then they would call them, to tell them that there are other rallies, that this is going on, that's going on, and so these voyeurs became actors, and they just haven't found a way, and I'm not even sure that a president can do that. I mean, I don't know. And with the internet, I think definitely, because of just the nature of the technology, obviously it's been around for a while, but it's relatively new for any kind of, for getting power, it's really very useful. For kind of keeping power and disseminating things in that way, it's a whole different feeling to go to obamaforpresident.com and do this, and come to whitehouse.gov and, be involved in this. He has, though, used the internet to bypass. He's done relatively few press conferences, but he's done a lot of kind of YouTube-y, internet kind of stuff, which I don't think Bush ever did and might have done.
There's two questions there. Do you want to go first and then second?
Do you think that the disappointment that we've been talking about among the electorate is reflected in the media, and in the sense that the reporters who covered the 2008 campaign, it's unlikely that in the near future they will cover a race that's as exciting, that becomes as important in popular culture, that has such great characters as Barack Obama and Sarah Palin? And if so, do you think that that will give sort of short shrift to candidates in 2012, and will political coverage in the media suffer as a result?
Well, I mean, the problem is with public opinion is how do you gauge public opinion, especially in our day and age? I mean, I think to a much greater extent in the past, the media was public opinion. I mean, because it was an expression of public opinion. Now it's so diffuse that it's very difficult to know what public opinion is. I mean, is it Glenn Beck? Is it the New York Times? I mean, no, there is no one public opinion. So I think it's very difficult to tell how disappointed people are in Barack Obama. We'll see with the next elections. And I think it's way too early to tell. That some of the glamour has worn off, that's not surprising. Probably the same would have happened to JFK if he hadn't been shot. The initial honeymoon, which is always there, and it always wears off. And I agree with Gary. I mean, there's only so much a president can do about this. And I think also when you talk about the supporters, I mean, it's one thing mobilizing people to get elected. It's another thing mobilizing them for what? I mean, to get the health bill through. I mean, that's not a matter of getting crowds worked up. So. I don't see, and as far as the press there being less press excitement at the next election, I mean, that depends on who the candidates are. It depends on the circumstances. It will probably never, well, not never, but it's unlikely we'll see quite the same excitement that we saw in the last election for all the reasons Gary mentioned. I mean, it was genuinely something new. That's not going to happen again. People are going to get used to him. And also, people are going to get used to having a black president, which is all to the good. So we know it's not necessarily, it wouldn't necessarily be a good thing for that kind of feverish excitement to go on for too long. It's better that people get used to having a black president and not make too much of a big deal out of it anymore. But the next election, it probably will be quite exciting, but it depends, I think, on who's taking part.
Do you want to respond, Gary? We have a question here.
I'm quite interested in how to explain a sudden momentum of the Tea Party movement and its relationship to the media, because, I mean, I am European and I don't really understand these quite reactionary movements. And yeah, how did it suddenly has sprung up like that in the past 6 to 8 months? It's very interesting to suddenly see them all over the papers. Tea Party movement takes Massachusetts, etc.
Well, I'm a European too, and from your accent, I think we're from the same country. And I'm slightly surprised you find it so puzzling, because there is exactly the same media excitement in Holland over Geert Wilders. Because these are sexy characters. It's a story. They're outrageous, they're wild, and they appeal to a strong, popular, anti-elite sentiment. And it began, again, in our country. Why was it that Pim Fortuyn, a right-wing maverick, or a populist maverick, who came out of nowhere, mesmerized the television audiences, whereas the sort of mainstream politicians bored everybody to death? Well, it's the same thing here. A Tea Party is a much more exciting news story than watching about a bunch of stiffs in suits in Congress debating this or that. Or, I mean, it seems self-evident to me. And I'm puzzled by your puzzlement.
I mean, I think that one of the reasons that they were able to grow, which is something we've kind of skirted around, but was that, and this is not really like Europe, that there is a dedicated channel, there is a TV channel that is dedicated to this stuff, and there are a few radio shows that are dedicated to this stuff. And in this 10 days that I spent talking to these Tea Party people, they all watch Fox. I mean, all of them. And they kind of, they talk about Fox Fox News with a reverence and with a respect that I feel is quite important to engage with, actually. It's very easy to ridicule, but it's much more difficult to work out what's going on there, which I think is that as time goes on, with the fragmentation of the media, people are much more comfortable with a reality that they prefer, you know, and that Fox provides a kind of all-encompassing reality that they prefer. So they'll one really weird thing that a couple of them did was they'll say, yeah, there's that great British MP, that great guy, what's his name? And, you know, and they'll describe him, and then they'll say his name, and I'm like, I've never heard of this man. I don't know who you're talking about. And I don't know every British MP, but I would think, and it's like, it's an MEP who is from a kind of somewhat xenophobic kind of independent party who hates the National Health Service. Now, you really have to look hard to find someone in Britain who hates the National Health Service. And they did. And they found this guy, and they have him on all the time. And he'll say, yeah, they're going to kill your granny. And so he's a star on Fox News. I guarantee you, if you did a poll in Britain, no one would have heard of him. All of these people have heard of him. So there is a kind of, and so they'll say to me, but like, you know, everybody in England's really angry about the health service. I say, actually, kind of, they're not, really. They're really not. You know, I don't know what to tell you. but it's just not true. And so there's that, which is really kind of, and these people would have been angry anyway. I don't think Fox News created them, but it nurtured them, and it sustained them, and that it kept on talking about there's going to be this demonstrations, there's going to be, and on the first of those Tea Party kind of events, the biggest one, it was like a big Fox News rally. There were kind of loads of people kind of standing around and shouting, screaming, who were kind of reporting. And so there's that. There is that which is different, I think.
But most of us like to have a world, read about a world we approve of. I mean, if you go to a liberal dinner party in London and you want to hear opinions on America or the war in Afghanistan, you have more or less read The Guardian that day. I mean, that gives you a particular view of the world as well. And likewise, if you have dinner with a bunch of Tories, you know what was in the Daily Telegraph that day. And I don't think that, but I agree with you that, of course, that Fox has managed to amplify this voice, but this voice has always been there. Jefferson was hated by exactly the same sort of people, rural, evangelical, people who went to tent meetings and so on, and thought that Jefferson was a dangerous, liberal, elitist who was ruining America. And the monkey, you read H.L. Mencken.
But Jefferson wasn't in your house 24 hours a day.
No, that's of course.
I mean, Fox
so
News,
the amplification of voices and views is certainly of a different order than it was then. But that particular contrast of opinions, I mean, those particular voices in society have always been there. The problem of the East Coast, more or less secular, educated, urban elite, and the rural hinterland. I mean, if you haven't already, I'd really advise you to read H.L. Mencken's reports in the 30s and 40s on going to political meetings and writing about, especially the political conventions. And you see exactly the same kind of thing.
But now you have these things in your house, on your I mean, there are two ways in which this is different. And the first is that there's a difference between these things existing, which, as I said, Fox didn't create them. But there's a difference between these things existing and these things being permanently broadcast. But also that actually even much more recently, 20 years ago, people were watching, 4 or 5 broadcast channels. There was only so much narrowcasting you could get. Whereas now, and it's not as effective, but liberals can watch MSNBC and they get their bespoke reality from Rachel Maddow and Keith Olbermann, and that's a fact of technology, and then also through the blogosphere that they can do that, so that these things are a difference in degree that after a while become a difference in kind.
That's why I said earlier, I think it remains to be seen whether it's going to destroy the Republican Party or whether it'll somehow reinvigorate them, but one can also exaggerate the influence of the ranters and ravers. After all, Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and so on all hated McCain. They didn't want him to be the Republican candidate, and they did everything to undermine him. It didn't work, even among Republicans. And so it will have an impact, especially on the state level. Whether it'll really have an impact on when it comes to national presidential elections, I'm still pretty skeptical about that.
I mean, most populist movements here, as far as I'm aware, what happens is they burn quite brightly and they fade, and their agenda becomes absorbed into the mainstream political kind of into mainstream politics. And that seems, from most of the analysts that I've spoken to, including Republican ones, I spoke to Frank Luntz yesterday, who's a big Republican advisor, and he said that their inability to compromise, and he said he was lucky when he came out of any meeting with Tea Party people, he felt just relieved that his tires hadn't been slashed, and he's a Republican, and actually quite a right-wing Republican, that their inability to have they don't really have a candidate. I mean, they like Sarah Palin, but they don't love her, and they don't really want, I don't think they even want a candidate. But that, in all likelihood, I mean, at the moment, it's really their influence, electoral influence, has been limited to kind of two states, Kentucky and Florida. In the Senate races, Tea Party candidates are kind of making all the running. And that might grow, but I think in all likelihood their influence is going to be more political than it is electoral. I don't think they're going to get elected, but I think they're going to have a major effect or a substantial effect on the kind of things that people say who do want to get elected, which is why Specter left the Republican Party, because he said, I can't win with those people anymore.
There's a gentleman.
There's one more, the last question, yeah.
Okay, I'd like to ask you about the influence of Rupert Murdoch on this whole situation, because before he arrived on these shores, tabloid journalism was dying in this country. And he took something that was big in Australia and big in England with the gutter press, and he brought it here, and he revived the whole thing. And without him, you wouldn't have had Fox, and you wouldn't have all these ranters and ravers.
I'm not sure that without him we wouldn't have had a version of Fox. So it's easy to blame everything on him. I don't like him much. I think he's...
He speaks very highly of you.
I think he's certainly... he's... I wouldn't perhaps go so far as to say ruined, but I think he's lowered the tone of what were once good newspapers like the London Times. But I think again, I mean, my role this evening seems to be to say that everything is exaggerated, but I think he's an awful man, but I don't think that he can be, the forces that he's exploiting as a businessman, and I think he's first and foremost a businessman. I mean, what he does is to make profit, and that's what he should be doing. And there should be laws that make sure that such people don't become too powerful. But I think if it hadn't been him, there would have been another businessman who would have exploited forces that are there anyway. So I'm not so convinced that without him we wouldn't have had Limbaugh and Beck and Fox. And so I think it was there ripe for the picking.
I think one of the things about Murdoch, the frustrating things, is that he's actually really very good at what he does. That the reason that these, I mean, I don't like what he does, but there's a recognition in terms of popularizing right-wing sentiment. He's very effective, and the one thing you have to concede about Fox is that it's effective, and similarly with the Sun, even with the Times, which is by no manner of means the London Times is not the paper that it was, but it sells more papers than it did. I agree with Ian. I mean, he supported Blair. He was, even though there is this sense that he is shaping events, actually he's always holding his hand up and seeing which way the wind blows, and then deciding. So he's come out in support of Cameron in England, but not that strongly, because he's not that convinced he's going to win. But he is enormously powerful. I do think without him, conversations in Britain about the euro would be very different, for example. And I do think that combination of being good at that and having shed loads of money has really... someone else probably would have come along. Other countries have these media moguls. But he's particularly good at it. And the fact that he is here in such a big way, I do think that does have an effect on American politics, which can be overstated, but is still considerable.
I think we should end it on that very depressing. No, say that. But thank you to our two speakers, Buruma and Gary Younge. And thanks to you, the audience, for coming. Thank you very much.